the next question there is from Karen. She says, how do we, thank you, and to all the speakers, of course, and regarding solidarities and connections, how do we remain focused on the linkages of anti-colonial struggles and histories without collapsing or invisibilizing the specificities of context? And I'll throw this open now to all the speakers. Before I do that, I just wanted to say that was just amazing. There are so many connections between the speakers and so many interconnections. And I felt like, in effect, that was a response to Karen's question. There was a lot of specificity with each context, but I'll leave it, I'll put this question to all the speakers. Anyone want to take it? Adam, you're smiling.
I mean, of course, there's no like perfect blueprints to answering that kind of question. But I think it's really important for us to. I think there are really clear examples of the way in which people have identified those linkages, and I think those have been drawn out today a great deal, right? Whether it be the fact that there are links between the Israeli state and our universities, or the Israeli state and the British state, or the US state, right? There are really clear linkages there. But of course, when we look at the material conditions that exist on the ground, we see fundamentally different material conditions for Black communities in the US in comparison with Palestinians living under occupation. And I think it would be very lazy of us to try to collapse those things into being the same thing. And I think very often it's actually the effect of our enemies, particularly journalists on the right or what have you, who try to create the impression that that's what we're trying to do. Very, very often I'm asked by journalists, oh, but Britain isn't the same as America though, is it? So why is there Black Lives Matter here? But of course, no one has said that Britain is the same as America. But what we do say is that racist struggles for anti-racism are connected, and we have solidarity. That's what we're saying. And so I think it's often a tool of the liberal establishment to try to create the impression that building links of solidarity is trying to collapse things into being the same way. And I think it's really important for us to push back against those kinds of assumptions.
Excellent, thanks, Adam. There's another question here to Rafif and Rahul. Could you elaborate on the latest initiatives in terms of decolonizing the curriculum at SOAS? Example, the working group led by Meera Sabaratnam, an issue where it has already an established tradition. So maybe, should we start with Rafif?
Sure. The one thing I guess I would start by saying is we need to think of the decolonizing process and issue at SOAS in broader terms, especially at this particular moment, because as with other universities across the UK, SOAS is facing a severe financial crisis. There is talk of austerity and COVID. And again, most of the cuts, as with other universities across the country, they are hitting the lowest paid workers on our campus, and they're hitting mostly BAME staff as well. So any context of decolonization that we speak about needs to take that front and center. There has been an ongoing working group at SOAS that's dealing with the decolonization agenda. I think it's been important to putting the conversation front and center in how we think of our curricula, in how we think of designing our classroom, and just putting those questions right there in a way that I don't think has happened at other universities to the same extent. It's an unfinished project. And with all unfinished projects, there are various ways it can go. I think, as Raoul pointed out, universities behave as corporations, and in that way can very easily take some of those moves that are instigated by students, usually not by academics, by the way, and take them in directions that are more marketing direction, that are a direction that's about making the university look better, without actually doing the really hard work of decolonization. So I think it's important when we think of decolonizing agendas that we think of them as things in process that can go in various directions depending on how critical we are, what we want to do with them, and the student body. Personally, I am very wary of the way often we de-link decolonizing the curriculum from the university as an institution, where students pay fees, for example, where there are workers who work. I disagree fundamentally with this concept that you can decolonize the curriculum while all the other structures are happening. Because what does it mean if students on a very basic level cannot afford to pay to go to university? Is that not a decolonizing issue? So that would be my perspective, and I'm sure Raoul can say more about the SOAS specificities.
Yeah, I 100% agree with Rafeef. And in fact, many of my comments were coming out of a frustration with the way in which the decolonization agenda has been taken up by the institution in SOAS, but not just at SOAS. I think it's just an example of a tendency that is much more widespread. Even when it comes to the curriculum, I mean, think about this. A lot of our inspiration for the decolonization struggle actually comes from African thinkers and movements. I mentioned South Africa, but another text to think about is perhaps Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind, which is also the name of one of our student societies, which pushed for this agenda within the institution. What's interesting about Ngugi's argument is that a lot of it is built on the idea of language as a primary terrain for the decolonization of the mind. And yet, what we see when finances become difficult, languages are some of the most threatened subjects in the curriculum. So on the one hand, we're paying a kind of lip service to this idea of decolonizing the mind while forgetting the substance of the argument and allowing, in fact, the substance of that argument to become vulnerable to the financial pressures that we are currently under. And it's not just something happening at SOAS, but it's one illustration of, I think, the shallowness of some of our decolonization achievements. And the other thing I would say is that sometimes for social justice movements, the moment of victory can become as threatening as potential defeat. And by this, I mean that when these social justice demands become taken up by institutions and become institutionalized and bureaucratized, we often lose a lot of the sort of collective energy behind them. And the transformation of these demands into bureaucratic requirements ends up hollowing them out. So, for example, at the moment, we have a lot of discussion of the racial awarding gap between differently raced groups of students. And this is a really important issue. We need to pay attention to it. But the university's preferred way of action on these kinds of issues is to make this yet another metric in an exercise like the TEF, and to then judge universities on the basis of those TEF metrics. They will be awarded marks, gold, silver, bronze, etc. And these will then become ways in which universities compete with each other in the neoliberal marketplace. So what begins as a social justice demand, even though it is successful in making its case to be taken seriously, becomes taken up institutionally and transformed into this marketized rubric, right? And this, to me, is not the success of a social justice demand. It becomes yet another element of neoliberal regulation cascading on us from above. It's not taken seriously, and over time it becomes hollowed out, formalistic, and unmoored from the context in which it was originally forged.
Thank you. I'm just looking and not, there aren't any more questions that have been posted, and we're also sort of probably at closing time. I think I might just throw one question and maybe ask each speaker to just briefly comment. So I felt like what I picked up with each speaker, or at least some of the interconnections that were happening, is that on the one hand, you have this layer of the possibility of appropriation of social justice or political justice struggles or economic justice struggles. So there's a bureaucratization of that, either in the university or, diversity training for police or the army, or, whichever institution you might think of, but then you have this real sort of energy of the people themselves fighting a struggle that is where the potential lies, right? That is where the political potentiality lies. It's not with the bureaucratization as such. So in that sense, then, I mean, and then the other sort of element to that is that I think maybe it was Tommy who mentioned this, that, you know, the capacity of activism is activists in terms of exhaustion and energy is also limited, like, you know, so there's that element to it as well. And so what do you think are some of the practical, I don't even want to say just practical, I hate the word practical, but what are both the philosophical and practical and theoretical ways forward? And maybe if everyone can just have a brief comment on that. I know that many of you already sort of pointed to these things, but I think as last words, that would be great. In the spirit of demilitarize, decolonize, and be anti-colonial, not just de.
Can I just?
Yes. Yes.
So kind of going back to the like 2 questions ago about kind of grouping all the specificities together, I do think that there is like a running theme throughout like events in history. So 3 that kind of like stood out to me were like the Parsley massacre in Haiti, in Dominican Republic, the Biafra War in Nigeria, and the Rwandan genocide. And I do think that those 3, whilst they happened in different parts of the world, different like times, there is like a running theme throughout. And I think linking back to like your question, like there are Biafran activists today, even though the Biafran War happened in 1967 and it ended in 1970. So I do think by focusing on the people who are still doing the groundwork, because I do think like activists on the ground, they know like they're well versed, they know what they're talking about, they know what they want. So I think by kind of maintaining them in the focus of the discussion around anti-colonialism and white supremacy and stuff like that, I do think it will be the best way, if not the only way, to actually move forward and actually decolonize like organically. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, please, all the speakers feel free. Should I call on you, or would you like to just start? I might ask Tommy to start off because you haven't said anything yet in the comment section.
Okay, I think mainly, it's the idea that solidarity is a doing word. It's an action that you have to take. It's not just empty statements and words that we put out, oh, I'm in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle, or blah, 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 blah. No, it's something that we actually have to actively do, because yeah, that point about capacity is, I think, the biggest limiting factor. There are people who care, there are people who are out there trying to do the work, but ultimately, when we see these social movements, in general, you know, there's hype around them for a while and then they begin to die down. And if there isn't that engagement with it, that solidarity shown with these different anti-colonial movements across the world, the political education which allows people to understand that they're interlinked, and actual material through time and resources being support given by the mass of the people to the people doing the work, then I think we'll see a fading out of this moment and we'll lose it as a potential for sort of radical change in an anti-racist sense.
Thanks, Tommy. There are lots of lessons to learn from the idea of solidarity as doing, not just expression. I'll move to Arthur now.
Sure. Yeah, thinking about solidarity, I also feel like, you know, when we think about solidarity, it's almost like we all have to be on the same page, so to speak, and or maybe, you know, paying special attention to the idea of specificities. If we look at thinking about third world feminism, or even thinking about intersectional feminism and drawing from feminist praxis, where we have this sort of transversal solidarity that is followed in thinking of feminist praxis, where we have our own specificities and we respect them, but at the same time, just like third world feminism, that school of thought propagates that women are not a universal category, nor are the solidarities, or where we are expressing these solidarities, but we are different peoples and we are coming together as under the rubric of solidarity, but as coalition and alliances. That's how I like to see these subsections, for the lack of a better word, coming together, and and just being respectful of the differences, and not trying to mush together our causes, and not trying to mush together the solutions for those causes. And I see that happening. It used to happen a lot between Palestine and Kashmir, and now I see that we are at a juncture where we are very carefully trying to parse out what are the overlaps and what are the differences, and how differences do not make us that different, but because these are the two different parts of the world, the peoples are different, cultures are different, there might be overlaps, but paying attention to that and thinking in terms of alliances and coalitions and transversal solidarities, rather than just fixed homogenous idea of solidarity that sometimes makes it feel like too stringent.
I call on can I call on Rafif?
Sure. Thank you, first of all, for organizing the event, and everyone who's stuck with us for this long. It's great to see the interest in the conversation. The first thing I would say is something Robin Kelly said recently around a Black Palestinian solidarity, is that we shouldn't think of solidarity as a transaction. I think one of the things that has happened in the past few decades of neoliberalization is it's really changed not just our interactions with each other and our subjectivity, but our radical imaginary as well. That even when we think of solidarity, we think of it as an interaction. I give you a little and I take a little from you, and it has to be equitable. But if we think of solidarity in a much more fundamental way, that my very survival depends on your survival, and the survival of the planet depends on us actually doing something to save it, it becomes much more of a necessity and a praxis. It's also not something that just appears one day and you have all the answers. It is a praxis of work and learning. So in trying to organize in Canada, for example, with Indigenous communities, there was quite a lot to learn, to sit back and listen. And those are virtues, I think, in organizing that sometimes in the heat of the moment we forget about. A sociologist that I really admire, a good friend of mine called Alan Sears, has written about something. He frames it as an infrastructure of dissent, that what we need to really be rebuilding is infrastructures of dissent that hold us and sustain our movements. And this goes to the question of capacity. If we think of past moments of struggle, people had spaces to interact in that were also spaces of leisure, where you could build a community to sustain things over the long term. Things like art and poetry and education were part of movements, and we very much have been like divided out of the more cultural aspects of our movements. Building that kind of infrastructure again, rebuilding it, but also being patient with ourselves and realizing that it's the slow work that we do in between the ebbs that is what keeps us going, I think is really important.
Thanks, Rafif. Should I call on, I'll call on Rahul now. Thank you.
Thanks. Sorry. I guess when I think about solidarity, I think the distinction between identification and identity is important for me. To identify with somebody is not the same thing as claiming identity with them. And I guess this resonates very much with what Atil was saying about commonality, but also difference, and being attentive to those things. And I guess because we've also been talking about capitalism and racism and institutions, the other sort of concluding thought I would offer is that for very often the question is whether to work within institutions or outside them, or partly inside and partly outside, using their resources but for some other purpose. I think often here of Fanon's resignation letter from the hospital that he worked in, which he writes at the moment when it becomes evident to him that no matter what he does within this institution, the problems are much bigger in a sense, and that he has to step outside of that system in order to attack them. And I think that's a very instructive moment. But for me, what is significant about this is the question is not so much whether to work within or outside. The question is when to do this and when to do that. And being able to make those judgments is, for me, what politics is about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I was younger, I always grappled with, should I work inside or outside? But I think you put it very clearly. It cuts across. I mean, when? It's a great question. Adam?
I'm really not sure what I could add to all of those brilliant responses that hasn't already been said about solidarity. But I think that, yeah, without repeating what other people have said too much, I think it's really fundamental that we push back against the kind of attempts by the state and by capital and by liberalism more generally to co-opt these movements, to strip them from their relationship to capitalist exploitation and state violence, and to make them something which is purely about identity or purely about representation or purely about interpersonal interactions with people and utilizing the kind of the language of privilege or hate crime or unconscious bias, which of course, hatred exists and people do have privilege and there is unconscious bias, but these things on their own strip racism of what's fundamental about it, which is what's fundamental about racism is the fact that it's linked with capitalist exploitation and it's linked with state violence, which is used to control and often kill. And so I think that by understanding the ways in which racism is fundamentally linked to these kinds of material realities, I think we can therefore better see how they're linked to other people's material realities as well, people in other parts of the world and other parts of the country. And so by seeing the way in which it's linked through those kind of materialities, I think it's one of the ways in which we can simultaneously push back against state and capitalist co-optation, whilst at the same time drawing upon those fundamental links and connections.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, really, to all the brilliant speakers. You were amazing. I think you've given us so much to think about. But as you mentioned, and I think one of you mentioned this, that this is, I think Rafif said we shouldn't just think about the flashes and the crises. And Tommy was saying, the road ahead is long and hard. And we know that in different movements, there's always different levels of exhaustion, but then again, a regeneration. And I think I'm just thinking of, I suppose my solidarities with Kashmiri academics, with Kashmiri networks, people who work in human rights in Kashmir and so on. And the rapid, amazing, terrible sort of changes over the last years is devastating. And a good friend said, there is no option. It's like a marathon. We have to keep running now. There is no option. We cannot stop. We have to keep going. So in that journey, I wish you all the best. I hope that, many of us will have all these continual interactions and interconnections that we can see. I hope that those alliances and that deep thinking and those deep, expansive understandings of what these interconnections are will keep coming and will coming to us as we build these alliances. So thank you to all the brilliant speakers. Thank you so much to my co-moderators and co-hosts, and thank for all the work in managing the event. And I really thank all the participants for joining us, and especially those who stayed on till the end. We will be putting up hopefully video clips of the speakers on the Social Theory Center web pages. But the struggle continues and it's a long road ahead. So thank you to everyone. Thank you.